Carthage, founded around 800 BC by the Phoenicians. What would one day grow to become one of the ancient world's greatest cities began as a small, humble fishing village, and by humble, I mean it accidentally became one of the richest cities in the classical world by doing what every empire dreams of doing, sitting in the way of everyone else's shipping routes and charging everyone lots and lots of rent. I am AncientSwan, thank you so much for coming, hopefully you'll stay forever, and if you haven't figured it out yet, today we are all about Carthage, where it came from, where did it go, and how did it get there, Cotton Eye Joe? According to legend, the city was founded by Queen Dido by tricking a local king into giving her the area. She did this by asking for as much land as she could fit into a bull's hide. She then sliced it into strips and claimed a whole hill. Personally, I'm not sure how that works, but instead of proving the deal impossible, there's a good chance instead that it really just proves how dim I am, and that I too could very easily be tricked by a Phoenician and some early real estate hustle. Strategically perched on a hill near the Lake of Tunis, Carthage had deep natural bays perfect for trade, war, and eventually dramatic overkill. Every ship crossing the Mediterranean had to pass between Sicily and Tunisia, which meant Carthage got rich just for existing. It was the ancient version of putting a toll booth in the middle of a freeway and calling it civilization. The wealth of Carthage cannot be underestimated, and it quickly became the capital city of the ancient Carthaginian civilization. This great city also contained what was known even in its own time as one of the world's greatest wonders, the Grand Harbour of Carthage. Carthage's Grand Harbour was so impressive it made Roman engineers cry into their aqueducts. It had a rectangular commercial section and a circular military section because, you know, nothing says we're better than you like geometry. Ships docked in outer rings for maintenance, while the inner island served as the VIP lounge for boats and their hoity-toity super-rich boatmasters. Carthage was a republic, which in ancient terms means a bunch of rich guys pretending to care about the poor. It was run by a bunch of judges who called themselves shofets, and a senate that made decisions based on who had the most trade routes, the most money, and, well, the least moral compass. Think of it as a corporate boardroom where every vote is sponsored by the olive oil lobby. Now we might as well talk about the elephant in the room, and no, not Hannibal's. Carthage allegedly practiced child sacrifice to appease their god, the great Baal Hammon, their top-tier deity in the please don't ruin our crops department. Whether this was real or just Roman smear propaganda, it gave Carthage the kind of reputation that makes modern PR firms weep. The truth is that historians are still torn on whether these child sacrifice stories are true or really was just a Roman rumor designed to make their enemies look bad. But either way it worked, and many to this day still look down on the city with great reproach. Meaning that despite the lack of evidence to support this theory, 2,000 years later, there are many who still express strong disapproval of the Carthaginians and their inability to babysit their neighbor's child. For all we know, maybe it was just a misunderstood daycare nursery with extreme consequences for poor attendance. But Carthage didn't just sit around counting coins and looking at boats. They spread their influence across Iberia, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and, well, even more places. Carthage went about collecting islands like they were Pokemon. Every time somebody blinked, Carthage had annexed another coastline and installed a trade outpost with a suspicious number of spears. However, this would not go unnoticed forever, and eventually that other fledgling empire just across the sea, the one they called Rome, began to take an interest in Carthage, and a mentality of, this town ain't big enough for the both of us, soon began to take root. The Carthaginian Republic was one of the longest-lived and largest states in the ancient Mediterranean world. However, with great empires come great wars. The Romans fought 3 wars against Carthage known as the Punic Wars, from the Latin Punic, meaning Phoenician. Because once wasn't enough and twice was just foreplay. It was during the Second Punic War that the legendary story of Hannibal arises, the Carthaginian general on a mission and a lifelong sense of having something to prove. Hannibal famously crossed the Alps with an army of elephants to attack Rome, but it was Hannibal's father, another famous Carthaginian general, Hamilcar Barca, who had brought the family to Spain around 237 BCE in order to further expand the empire there. Hannibal did not bring elephants to Spain himself, but rather used the ones they already had, The transport of elephants across the Mediterranean Sea had been the amazing achievement of his forefathers. Getting them across the Mediterranean Sea itself must have been the accomplishment of a lifetime. Can you imagine getting onto a rickety wooden boat with an elephant and praying to every single god you'd ever heard of that the elephant would stay calm and still for the many, many, many hours it would take to cross the rolling seas? I'd be like, nah, bro, you take the elephant, and I'll get onto this other boat over here, the one with the dead goat and 3 men with leprosy. And so, 20 years after the crossing, a young Hannibal gets an army of elephants to use as he wishes. Today's rich kids get a nice car, but in the old days, the rich kids got armies of elephants and a country to invade. So, at a nice young age of just 28 years old, Hannibal departed from Spain around April or May of 218 BCE. He marched his army along with 37 elephants across the Pyrenees and into Gaul, modern-day France, before merrily skipping his way through southern France and beginning the difficult crossing of the Alps to invade Italy. I mean, some of them obviously died along the way, but can you imagine the Roman shock? They've been focusing their efforts and eyes looking south, when suddenly this big, giant army of elephants appears to their north. I think it's fair to say that quite a few Roman bricks were shat on this day. Hannibal arrived in northern Italy in November 218 BCE before quickly engaging the Roman army and winning his first major victory on Italian soil at the Battle of the Trebia in December of that same year. Rome eventually went on to win the Second Punic War, but very important lessons were learned in the meantime. Then, sometime later during the Third Punic War, and after almost 700 years of domination, the city of Carthage suffered its first destruction in 145 BC, as war brought the might of Rome to its walls. Despite this destruction, the Romans rebuilt the bits they'd messed with, and Carthage went on to become one of the Roman Empire's grandest cities. Carthage remained an important Roman city for almost 5 centuries, until the early 400s when the Roman Empire began to fall. Now, very quickly before we continue, I'd like to remind you that if you don't subscribe, then my wife hangs me upside down and beats me with branches until I bleed. She says it's good for my skin, but honestly, I don't believe her. She laughs when she's doing it too. Anyhow, back to the video. So for the next 500 years, Carthage remains a jewel of the Roman Empire. But as we now know already, Rome also did not last forever. Fast forward to the year 429 AD. When the Vandals, yes, that's their actual name, decided Carthage looked too intact and decided to fix that. The Vandals themselves had been refugees who were pushed out of northern Europe a couple of decades earlier. Imagine fleeing Sweden because their own invading Gothic neighbours were getting a bit too stabby, crossing over into Germany for some peace and quiet, and then having to flee once again because not only had the Goths decided to follow them south, but also the new invading Huns were arriving to their east, and then spending decades wandering across Western Europe into Spain, crossing into Africa, and eventually ending up at Carthage. That's a refugee story and a half. It's estimated that around 120,000 Vandals started the journey in Germany in the year 406 CE, and they began more than 30 years of refugees, beginning in northern Europe and ending up in North Africa. Generations constantly on the move, never knowing peace and stability, always being moved on from one place to the next, never having a place you could call your own. By the time they reached southern Spain, there were around 80,000 people left. 80,000 people who one day took a look at the waters of the Mediterranean Sea and thought, well, might as well. It's been a lifetime of absolute shit so far, how much worse can it get? The Vandal king Genseric led his people from Spain to North Africa and saw that the once great city of Carthage lay waiting for them, ripe for the taking. They took a look at Carthage and thought, yes, that'll do. And so, for a century and some change, Carthage existed as a Germanic city ruled by the descendants of refugees from Sweden across the Baltic Sea. But fighting over this great city was not finished yet. The Byzantine Eastern Romans soon came back and retook the city in 533 AD, because apparently no one had anything better to do than play historical tug-of-war with the same patch of land. However, the Byzantine Romans of Africa were not able to withstand the 7th century Muslim conquests which followed them. In AD 686, the Umayyad Caliphate sent an army who won a battle over the Romans and Berbers close by. However, they did not succeed in capturing Carthage. Yet. In the year 698 AD, the Umayyads returned, but this time with more anger and, well, a whole lot more stabbings. They defeated the Byzantines again and decided that Carthage was just far too tempting to leave standing. Despite their victory, the Muslim army had been severely weakened. So, fearing that the Byzantine Empire might once again reconquer the city, the Umayyads decided to destroy Carthage once and for all. So they did what every insecure empire does. They rage-quit history. Honestly, it was the geopolitical equivalent of flipping the Monopoly board. In a scorched earth policy, Carthage's great city walls were torn down. The water supply from its aqueducts was cut off. The agricultural land was ravaged. Crops were burned and the earth poisoned with as much salt as they could find. And finally, its harbors were filled in and made unusable. And with that, Carthage was no more. Carthage was gone. A city that had birthed emperors, survived invasions, and hosted more drama than most folk could handle, was reduced to dust. Because empires, just like my annoying little children, also do not know how to share. Fortunately, though, despite my spawn's inability to learn from me, I myself am able to share, and now I think maybe it's time to share what we've learned today. What has the destruction of a great city taught us in the 21st century? Well, as always, I've learned that perhaps nothing lasts forever. No matter how grand you build it, no matter how rich or powerful it becomes, everything can and will one day fall, just like everything else. In fact, sometimes that itself can be the reason that someone else might want to tear it down, like a jealous neighbor standing with a bag of marshmallows as he watches your house burn to the ground. Some neighbors are cool, but some are utter assholes and should not be trusted. Carthage's wealth made it a target, so perhaps sometimes it is better to be humble than to be too successful. I guess also that I've learned the war is always more important than the battle. Hannibal's Alps stunt became legend, but it didn't win the war. Meaning that just because you can bring elephants to Italy doesn't mean you should. The Muslim armies didn't just defeat Carthage, they deleted it, meaning I think I've also learned that if I do happen to be losing, I should probably start negotiations before my house becomes a metaphor for obliteration. Carthage was brilliant, it was bold, but it was also ultimately bulldozed, and I think we should probably all try not to repeat that with our own homes today. And so that's it for me today, peeps. I'm off like beef stroganoff. I've got another 1,000 videos to work on and perhaps not enough lifetime left in me. And before we go, don't forget to pay humble homage to YouTube's greatest Patreons, whose names shall always be recorded as Thad S, George H, Stephen, Malichi I, DD, Anthony T, and David R. As always, thank you all the mostest. And don't forget also to like and subscribe with your clicky button fingers. Apparently it helps or something, I don't know, I know nothing. Until next time, peace, love, and Carthago delenda est. Good, bye!